The air became unbreathable the moment a toxic cloud, scorching at over 900 degrees Fahrenheit, swallowed the streets of Pompeii in 79 AD. The thermal collapse was merciless. Within hours, an entire city was silenced beneath feet of ash. But in the atrium of a lavish villa, a massive structure of forged iron and oak held firm against the inferno. When experts finally cracked open the locks of this ancient safe, nearly 2,000 years later, the discovery left them stunned. There was no gold, the kind the old looters so desperately hunted. The fury of Vesuvius sealed the fate of thousands. But through one of nature's most bitter ironies, the volcano itself formed a perfect shield, preserving the darkest secrets of the Roman elite completely intact. When we think about the final hours of that coastal city in 79 AD, the image that comes to mind is one of absolute despair. The chaotic flight through narrow streets, a summer sky that suddenly went black in the middle of the afternoon, and the relentless rain of ash and volcanic rock. The historical memory of that event has always focused on the fate of those citizens, the ones who searched for shelter, ran toward the sea, and were inevitably overtaken by the unstoppable fury of the mountain. It's only natural that the human tragedy dominates our memory. Yet, while the people left everything behind, the true power of the city stayed exactly where it had always been: cold, silent, and deeply anchored in the stone floor. In the wealthiest, most exclusive districts of the city, far from the eyes of common people, the luxury villas housed the financial heart of the elite. In the atriums of those monumental estates, powerful merchants, magistrates, and moneylenders kept their imposing strongboxes. These were the maximum security safes of the Roman imperial period. And they didn't just hold mountains of gold coins or silver cups. They protected the very nervous system of the local economy. Contracts, debts, mortgages, and transactions that decided who lived in wealth and who fell into ruin. If you appreciate deep historical investigations and want to understand the details that time tried to erase, subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep uncovering the truths buried beneath centuries of dust. What we're about to break open here is far more than an isolated archaeological find. It is physical proof of how influence and control operated just minutes before the end of the world. We're going to analyze, in detail, the remarkable engineering of one specific strongbox, a structure so dense and so well built that it endured tons of debris and unthinkable temperatures without giving an inch. While ceilings collapsed and thick walls cracked under thermal stress, this armored chest absorbed the initial impact. The owner of that safe, one of the wealthiest and most feared creditors in the region, had it built with a single purpose: to stop human hands from stealing his fortune. He certainly never anticipated that the threat would come from above, and remarkably, the very flames that consumed the wood's surface found barriers of iron and an absence of oxygen that sealed the interior completely airtight. When modern science finally broke through that impenetrable shell, what came out handed researchers the most intimate archive of Rome's financial underworld. Ordinary documents never would have survived, but the exact materials stored inside underwent an extraordinarily rare physical reaction, one that preserved the evidence for eternity. Today, we're going to understand how this strongbox survived the worst day in the ancient world, locking away material proof that human bureaucracy and greed remain perfectly intact, even when the sky is falling. Before we go deeper into the heart of this story and uncover the precise details of how this true fortress was built, I'd like to take a brief moment to learn more about who's watching with us. Drop a comment right now telling us what country you're watching from, because we read every single one and make a point of responding to each of you. Understanding the fragments of our past is something that connects people from every corner of the world. With that, let's return to the 1st century, walking through the silent corridors lined with towering marble columns inside the great estates of the province. To understand the immeasurable value of what rested in the atrium of that central home, we need to step inside the mindset of the financial elite of that era. In that prosperous coastal region, the flow of wealth was constant and quiet. There were vast trade routes, major ports receiving precious cargo every single day, and relentless auctions of large tracts of land. And wherever an extreme concentration of influence and power exists, a strictly proportional distrust is born immediately. Rome's most powerful businessmen did not trust their greatest assets to outside institutions or public administrators. The central and impregnable bank of a truly powerful man was his own home. At the architectural heart of those imposing villas, positioned strategically right in the main atrium to be seen by every debtor who walked through the front door, stood the ultimate symbol of that owner's unquestioned authority: his enormous, heavy, and dark strongbox. The order to design one of these monumental safes was never handed to ordinary city carpenters. This was a rigorous project in defensive engineering, adapted for the domestic environment of an unimaginably wealthy civilian. The owner of that particular luxury villa, widely feared across the entire region as the hidden financial backer of local bureaucracy, demanded an absolutely impenetrable structure. The technical process began with the surgical selection of raw materials. The defensive foundation of this fortress required the methodical cutting of the oldest, densest, and thickest oak trunks from the most distant forests. After felling, the timber underwent a slow and rigorous drying process in dark, shaded warehouses. This obsessive care guaranteed that the massive planks would not buckle under intense pressure, would not develop structural cracks over the years, and could not be pierced by handheld steel tools in the event of an attack. These colossal, heavy planks formed the silent core of the safe. But raw wood, no matter how superior, represented only the first line of defense. The sharp-minded creditor knew from personal experience that wood always surrenders to deliberate fire and human persistence. It was absolutely imperative to armor that vulnerable structure with a true war-grade shell. This is precisely the point where the project shifted from the quiet of the carpenter's workshop to the scorching heat of the master blacksmith's forges. Lit only by the glow of coal furnaces, heavy hammers shaped incredibly thick bands of pure iron, driven to extreme temperatures until reaching the exact point of bend. These wide strips of raw metal were wrapped tightly, still blazing hot, around the ancient oak core, crossing each other in intricate patterns both horizontally and vertically. They created a continuous, unbreakable protective grid that embraced the wooden box on every side. Each strategic intersection of those bands was drilled through and fastened by long, solid iron spikes. The sharp tips drove violently through the dense wood and were ruthlessly hammered flat on the inside with heavy mallets. As the metal cooled and naturally contracted, the heavy iron plates and the thick layer of wood fused into a single, inseparable body. The massive safe rose in stark contrast to the delicate frescoes and the lightness of the home around it. It was a hard and aggressively functional presence, designed only to remind everyone who walked through the door exactly who held absolute control over their debts and their lives. The cunning mind behind this security, however, lived in the locking mechanism. Rome's highest-grade security locks contained internal systems of surprising complexity, with tensioned metal springs and multiple bronze pins requiring enormous keys forged with dozens of teeth in highly specific positions. When the mechanism turned in the owner's hands, the deep, resonant sound of the heavy bolts sliding into precise alignment inside the thick door was the definitive confirmation that his fortune was secured. Yet, there was a serious logistical problem that haunted that powerful man's nights. No matter how colossal and unbreakable his iron strongbox was, the threat of a well-coordinated physical theft still hung in the air. A bold crew with enough manpower could simply break in under the cover of darkness, hoist the massive safe using ropes and industrial pulleys, and drag it whole off the property. Far from the city and its watchmen, the criminals would have all the days ahead to crack the structure at their leisure. The absolute terror that his financial empire could be literally carried out the front door drove one final and decisive defensive measure to be implemented. An engineering measure so extreme that it would permanently alter the course of modern archaeology centuries later. The colossal strongbox was not simply placed on the beautiful, colorful mosaic floor of the atrium. It was rigorously transformed into a geological extension of the stone residence itself. Structural engineers excavated a large square pit right in the center of the floor, drilling through dense layers of earth and fill until they finally reached the solid bedrock of the property's natural foundation. Into that bare rock, thick vertical iron rods were driven forcefully, pointing upward like anchor columns. The massive armored chest was then brought in with enormous effort and lowered millimeter by millimeter onto those hidden rods. To seal that bond in an unbreakable hold for eternity, boiling liquid lead was carefully poured into every gap and empty space around the hidden base. When that heavy metal finally cooled and hardened, it crystallized into an irreversible mechanical fusion. The giant dark safe was now firmly bolted to the skeleton of the earth itself. To move that enormous iron box even 1 inch, invaders would have had to destroy the deep foundations of the house itself with heavy pickaxes, a task far too loud and logistically impossible to carry out in the dark without alerting the local guard. The province's relentless creditor could finally sleep in peace, his tablets filled with confidential entries and the material proof of his vast influence were shielded against all human greed. What that incredibly powerful man could never have predicted is that the ultimate test of his formidable masterpiece would not come from the hands of common criminals. The supreme threat would not creep silently through the paved streets or try to scale the high walls of his villa in the dark hours. The overwhelming force would come from where he least expected. It would descend directly from the thick clouds of the mountain, bringing with it an infernal thermal fury and a pressure that no one in that era ever imagined witnessing. When the dense cloud of volcanic gas and rock finally reached the walls of the province, its force simply disintegrated the urban infrastructure in seconds. Entire walls of solid masonry were reduced to rubble under the relentless pressure of the volcanic advance. Magnificent ceilings came crashing down violently on those who, paralyzed with shock, could not escape in time, collapsing with the fragility of structures crushed beneath unbearable weight. Nearly everything that was not deeply rooted in the most basic foundations of the ground was hurled into the chaotic darkness and buried without mercy. But, with an incredible and dramatic silence, at the epicenter of that collapsed mansion, the monstrous strongbox held its ground. The imposing chest, firmly anchored to the stone floor, did not retreat, did not tremble. The brutal weight of aged oak, the thick mesh of pure iron, and the immutable fact that it was fully anchored into the bedrock through lead-fused rods kept the structure perfectly stable. The owner's intense defensive paranoia had, against all odds, built a perfect mechanical anchor against the brutal impact of nature. The armored box held firm through the wind and the barrage of volcanic rock. Yet, that first and devastating physical blow that struck the house was only the prelude to total collapse. The true silent threat, about to test the biological limits of iron and oak in the agonizing minutes that followed, was an incalculable wave of invisible heat, already beginning to melt everything around it. The pyroclastic storm. The initial mechanical impact, as devastating as it was in bringing down the thick villa walls and shattering the marble columns, represented only the first phase of the collapse. The fortress of iron and oak had proven its physical resistance, standing firm and anchored to the stone floor while the world above it was violently swept away. Yet, the true annihilating force that descended the slopes of Vesuvius that dark afternoon was not made only of fragmented rock and kinetic energy. What was moving through the winding streets of the city was a dense, heavy, and lethal mass of superheated gas, a relentless pyroclastic surge. To understand what happened in the exact milliseconds that this volcanic storm embraced the massive strongbox, we need to look at the extreme physics of the event. Modern geological records and the most recent excavations help us reconstruct the thermal landscape of that instant. Estimates suggest the temperature of that invisible, suffocating wave reached an astonishing 930 degrees Fahrenheit. When that pocket of extreme heat invaded what remained of the estate's atrium, the laws of nature began to act with brutal and merciless precision. Everything organic and fragile in the environment met its immediate end. Heavy linen curtains, delicately carved hardwood furniture, scrolls, and even the brilliant pigments of the frescoes on the walls were consumed by the scalding air in a matter of mere seconds. It was precisely in that scene of widespread combustion, under a sky that had turned as thick and dark as midnight, that the banker's imposing safe faced its most severe structural test. The forged iron wrapping the chest, which had once served as an impenetrable shield against nighttime thieves, began rapidly absorbing heat from the surrounding environment. The metal, darkened by soot, began radiating an unbearable temperature. And just beneath that incandescent armor, the dense core of centuries-old oak suffered its first thermal shock. The outer surface of the wood, directly exposed to the 930-degree gases, triggered a lightning-fast combustion process. The invisible residual water inside the wood fibers boiled instantly, creating small and violent ruptures, and the surface began to char aggressively, opening the door for fire to devour the entire structure. If that burning process had continued for just a few more minutes, the thick wooden wall would have given way completely. The infernal heat would then have transferred directly to the hollow interior of the safe. And what was inside, the owner's great treasure, was extremely sensitive. These were not gold coins that withstand fire, but dozens of fragile wooden tablets coated with thin layers of beeswax, where debts and contracts had been carved with Roman styluses. Wax melts at very low temperatures. It would have taken the interior of the safe reaching barely 175 degrees Fahrenheit for all proof of that man's power to melt away, turning into a shapeless puddle and erasing the financial underworld's secrets forever. The total collapse of that information seemed imminent and inevitable, but it was in this exact and critical millisecond, when the outer surface of the strongbox was already in flames and the heat was beginning to penetrate toward the core, that nature intervened with formidable irony. Vesuvius, the same mountain that had condemned the city to absolute destruction, sent the second element of its eruption, a colossal and heavy avalanche of lapilli, a dense mixture of incredibly fine volcanic ash and sharp pumice stones. This precipitation did not fall slowly like dark snow. It came down in massive, rapid, and suffocating volumes, filling the empty spaces of the collapsed house at a breathtaking speed. Within moments, feet upon feet of volcanic debris completely covered the safe, burying it under tremendous weight. And that rapid, violent burial triggered a life-saving chemical reaction. Fire, regardless of its intensity or the fuel it consumes, has one fundamental and unavoidable weakness. It desperately needs oxygen to survive. When the mountain of heavy, compacted ash swallowed the iron fortress, it created an absolute and immediate blockade against incoming air. The ash filled every gap, every millimeter of space between the metal bands and the stone floor, stripping all oxygen from around the burning structure. Without air to feed the flames, the fire on the outer surface of the oak was summarily suffocated and extinguished at its peak. The wood stopped burning before it turned to ash. Instead of being destroyed, the thick outer layer of the heavy oak trunk underwent what science calls deep carbonization. It transformed into a thick crust of pure charcoal. And charcoal, fascinatingly, is one of the most excellent and efficient thermal insulators found in nature. The black crust that formed around the safe embraced its interior, blocking the extreme heat still radiating from the volcanic ash all around it. The chest had effectively become a sealed environment, both mechanically and thermally armored. The volcano, in a stroke of pure geological unpredictability, had sealed the strongbox hermetically. Inside, wrapped in total darkness, a perfect vacuum, and the newly created thermal insulation, the temperature rose just enough to trigger an almost alchemical transformation in the documents. The mild heat that managed to cross the charcoal barrier did not melt the wax in a destructive way. Instead, the precise temperature triggered the crystallization of organic materials. The wood of the fragile tablets was slowly baked, petrifying into a solid and lasting state, while the fine incisions made by Roman styluses remained intact, frozen in their original form. That safe bolted to the ground ceased to be merely a financial instrument designed for the daily usury of an influential man. Under the monumental weight of the ash mountain, in absolute darkness and without a single breath of air, it became a true time capsule. Vesuvius silenced the merciless owner, silenced the desperate debtors, and quieted the corrupt magistrates of the province. But through a complex and unlikely convergence of physics and engineering, the mountain prepared the perfect conditions for the secrets bottled inside that chest to outlast time itself, waiting patiently beneath the earth for the moment when mankind finally had the tools to bring them back into the light. Nearly 2,000 years of silence. Absolute silence reigned over that coastal plain for nearly 2,000 years. The once thriving city, driven by the relentless ambition of its inhabitants, had been erased from maps and living memory. It remained hidden, buried beneath a heavy and unyielding crust of volcanic rock. Above that vast silent tomb, time ran its relentless course. Great empires rose to absolute power and then crumbled. Mankind advanced in great strides. New civilizations walked with confidence over that soil, and the surface world changed at a dizzying pace. Throughout that monumental stretch of time, dozens of feet below the ground, the massive fortress of iron and oak rested untouched. It remained perfectly isolated in the dark vacuum created by the mountain, guarding its secrets with an obliging silence. That eternal rest would only begin to be disturbed when we fast forward to the loud excavations of the 19th century. It was an era driven by a near-voracious hunger for archaeological discoveries that could be triumphantly displayed in the elegant corridors of Europe's finest museums. Explorers and large crews of laborers began systematically drilling through the hard crust of volcanic material. The daily work was exhausting and brutally manual. Under the blazing sun, men wielded heavy pickaxes and metal shovels, breaking through millennia-old rock inch by inch. The rhythmic sound of steel striking stone echoed through the deep trenches, slowly revealing the sidewalks and walls of grand homes that had not seen daylight in 19 centuries. The expectation driving those researchers through their fatigue was purely materialistic. They craved classical beauty. The burning hope was to find perfectly preserved bronze statues, flawless marble busts, delicate jewelry, and great chests overflowing with imperial gold coins. When the excavation maps finally guided the workers to the solid foundations of that particular luxury villa, the anticipation in the archaeological camp hit its absolute peak. From the vast span of the remaining walls and the intricate detail of the mosaic floors, it was clear this had been the residence of a man of incalculable influence, the great banker of the province. By the logic of that era, a home with that level of sophistication absolutely had to be hiding formidable treasures. The supervisors ordered the workers to advance with reverent care upon reaching the central atrium area. That was the exact place where Rome's elite had always put their power on full display. The shovels methodically scraped away the last layer of fine ash. The volcanic dust slowly settled. But what finally emerged from the dark soil drew a collective sigh of deep frustration and disappointment from everyone present. There was no dazzling glint of gold catching the daylight, no polished surface of a priceless sculpture. Right at the center of that once magnificent atrium, what the modern excavators found was an enormous, heavy, and repulsive black mass embedded in the stone floor. It was a solid structure that appeared to have faced the full thermal fury of the event and survived only as a twisted mechanical carcass. The original wood had been transformed into a thick, deeply dark crust of charcoal. The forged iron bands were oxidized, warped by time, and coated in layers of fused ancient grime. Faced with the towering expectation of finding a shining treasure, that armored and aesthetically aggressive chest looked like nothing more than a grim, abandoned piece of wreckage. The visual frustration quickly turned into a serious physical challenge. The researchers ordered the removal of that crude obstacle from their path so they could keep digging in search of real wealth. Strong men surrounded the structure with solid iron pry bars and thick ship ropes, straining their muscles to the limit. The ropes snapped taut under the force of the combined pull, but the dark safe did not move a single inch. It was only in that moment of exhaustion that the 19th century academics recognized the ingenious and paranoid defensive engineering at work. Cleaning the rough base of the mass, they discovered with astonishment the thick metal pins and pools of hardened lead anchoring the safe to the planet's own bedrock. The massive chest remained just as absolutely bolted to the ground as on the day it was first installed, centuries before. That undeniable realization lit a spark of intense intellectual curiosity. The reasoning turned sharp and cold. If a man of such power had commissioned a strongbox this dense, one permanently fused to the stone, then what rested in its dark interior was anything but trivial. Investigative fascination took hold of the group. Yet they could not take the chest intact without destroying the entire ruin with explosives. There was only one logistical alternative to uncovering its mysterious contents. The final order was given with heavy apprehension. Heavy industrial cutting tools and enormous sledgehammers were brought to the center of the ancient residence. They were going to crack the safe right there, using brute force in the exact spot where it had resisted the flames centuries before. The sharp sound of modern steel began pounding relentlessly against ancient iron. The great discovery waiting for them in that dark interior was about to come to light. What came out of the darkness? When the heavy age-old locks finally surrendered to the brute effort of the 19th century workers, the sharp sound of the break echoed off the ruined walls of that vast Roman villa. There was a dense, silent anticipation in the air. The academics present held their breath, bringing their oil lamps close to illuminate the dark interior of that block of iron and charcoal. They waited eagerly for the unmistakable gleam of imperial gold or the polished reflection of cut gemstones. But the flickering light revealed something that, at first glance, looked like a bitter and profound disappointment for the expedition's backers. The vast interior of the safe was completely devoid of precious metals. There was no dazzling material wealth that modern Europe had dreamed of finding. Instead, resting at the bottom of the black structure were small rectangular packets, carefully stacked and bound with the remnants of carbonized twine. 153 wooden tablets, the most common and prosaic office supply in all of the empire. Confusion swept through the team of scholars. The organic material of those thin planks should not have survived the cataclysm. The center of these small tablets had originally been filled with a thin layer of beeswax, where Romans used sharp styluses to scratch their daily notes, contracts, and financial receipts. Faced with a heat wave capable of toppling entire buildings, the wax should have boiled and evaporated in the first fractions of a second, permanently erasing any human record that had ever existed there. Yet, what modern science discovered upon analyzing those pieces up close was an extraordinary chemical phenomenon, a true glitch in the logic of destruction. The rapid and violent burial of the safe beneath tons of fine ash cut off every trace of oxygen completely. Without fresh air to feed the internal fire, and protected by the thick oak armor that had transformed into a perfect thermal insulator, the fragile tablets did not burn. The mild and constant heat that managed to penetrate the chest triggered an incredibly rare reaction. The wax did not melt in a chaotic way. The extreme external temperature, acting in that dark vacuum and under immense geological pressure, slowly cooked the wood, carbonizing its structure completely. The heat literally petrified the material. Instead of erasing the inscriptions, the brutal thermal force of Vesuvius crystallized the incisions, transferring the relief of the writing directly into the hardened wood. The volcano, in all its fury, had acted as a flawless preservation technician. What rested in the trembling hands of those researchers was not a pile of inert gold. They were 153 perfectly legible documents. Vesuvius had delivered to mankind the undeniable material proof of how the gears of financial power turned, minute by minute, just before the sky came down. The secrets, the mountain. Kept when the world's leading specialists began patiently translating the delicate inscriptions on those 153 tablets, the veneer of civility over the ancient province collapsed entirely. What emerged from the depths of that strongbox were not poetic records or documents of great imperial achievements. The owner of that enormous villa revealed himself, through his own confidential archives, not merely as a wealthy man, but as the silent financial predator of the entire region. He operated in the darkest shadows of the economy, building his vast empire through the ruin of others. The petrified documents detailed merciless transactions with a terrifying bureaucratic coldness. There were meticulous records of confiscated property auctions, suffocating interest rates charged to merchants driven to desperation, and merciless receipts from the trade in subjugated lives. The city's great creditors spared absolutely no one. Among the crystallized fragments, researchers found the signatures and hidden debt records of the most prominent figures in high society. Influential magistrates, political leaders, and major local merchants were all, in one way or another, inescapably trapped in that man's dense financial web. The illusion of power held by public authorities crumbled under the weight of the information contained in those small wooden tablets. The heaviest aspect of this great historical revelation, however, lay not only in the cruelty of the transactions, but in the exact chronology carved into the blackened wood. The dates etched into the fossilized structure showed that many of those extortive transactions and suffocating agreements had been formalized just days, and in some specific cases, mere hours before the sun disappeared forever beneath the dense and lethal toxic cloud. The relentless machinery of profit was running at full capacity, completely blind to the constant tremors already fracturing the stone streets and warning the alert population of imminent collapse. While the banker turned the heavy iron locks to seal his most recent gains and guarantees of power away in the dark, the mountain was already preparing the thermal storm that would render every last bit of that human effort absolutely meaningless. The most powerful irony in history archaeology is often the science of great ironies. When we examine the discovery of that heavy strongbox in the ruined atrium, we recognize the most poetic contrast in this entire historical investigation. The influence, the power, and the wealth to which the great creditor and his clients devoted their lives held no value whatsoever when the fury of Vesuvius arrived. The mountain made no distinction between the elite and the common people. All of them succumbed beneath 930 degrees Fahrenheit. The gold melted, the great villas crumbled, and the coins quickly lost all practical meaning. But through one formidable twist of nature, the cold and bureaucratic record of all that human greed survived nearly intact. The volcano forever silenced the Romans of that coastal province, but ended up immortalizing their debts. The outstanding balances of an entire society that ceased to exist in a single afternoon were handed down to us today, proving beyond any doubt that human influence turns to dust. But its darkest secrets endure through fire and time. That enormous block of iron fused to the bedrock teaches us that the most relentless force in nature could not erase the shadows of Pompeii. It bottled them for the future. Today, the 153 crystallized wax tablets are preserved as one of the greatest treasures of the ancient world. They prove, beyond all question, that the true legacy of a civilization rests not in the gold it accumulates, but in the records it desperately tries to protect. Vesuvius silenced the inhabitants of the province in 79 AD, but the engineering of that armored strongbox ensured that their most intimate secrets kept speaking, loud and clear, 2 millennia later. If you value the authentic recovery of human memory, subscribe to the channel. Here's something to sit with. What will our own society leave locked away for eternity when the dust finally settles? Thank you so much for your company today, and we'll see you on our next investigation.